It's not very often you have another MMORPG erected from the shadows, coming from a rather powerful, well-known name, and a fairly unlikely one at this point too. A pioneer in the virtual world space, responsible for creating one of the pillars of our genre, an early revolutionary browser MMORPG that started as far back as 2001, before growing to immense power in just 4 years later. Runescape might be a pioneer MMORPG, but unlike many of the other pioneers, it is still cooking, and manages to not only have 200 million total accounts, but even surpassed 1 million subscribers at one point, and still maintains a top MMO status as of 2026, with RuneScape 3 having dropped back in 2013, and the other RuneScape, old school RuneScape, having been a much more updated classic version of the game too. The Gower brothers are credited for being the major creative forces behind RuneScape, and were also the founders of Jagex, the company behind the game. Andrew, Paul, Ian are names that almost all RuneScape fans and even MMORPG gamers know and knew in the early 2010s. And then in an unsuspecting move, Andrew Gower would depart both RuneScape and Jagex altogether, seemingly being made into a footnote after, with major questions as to why. Time would pass and Andrew would appear again, this time with a new company, Fen Research, with the desire to make a new MMORPG, one that would try its best to escape the massive shadow his previous MMORPG had cast and was continuing to cast even. Brighter Shores would spring from the darkness much later in 2024, with a cute and quaint trailer that seemed very RuneScape coded, to which it then would launch into early access of all places later that same year in the fall. While Brighter Shores would attract some serious initial interest due to the legendary creators behind the project, within just a few months the game's population had fallen off a cliff, which might be normally recoverable for an early access title, but as we will find out in this episode of Death of a Game, certain issues would plague Brighter Shores, which is why despite it not being dead yet, it's being featured on the series for its 2026 player count of under 200 players peak. The Death of a Game series is a series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to the faltering of Brighter Shores by utilizing a timeline of events, filled with clues and bits of evidence, but most importantly, we activate our detective intuition, especially during the final deduction, where we crack the case for good, in case you missed any of the clues along the way. So, detectives, how did one of the most legendary creators in the MMORPG space fail to capture diamond, platinum, or even gold with his newest effort in the genre? Well, get ready to do some mouse-clicking, detectives. We have Hope Port to adventure in and investigate. The story begins coming off the rise of a newly minted virtual world, an MMORPG of the new age, and one that took ideas of previous games and put it in a package that had never been before seen or accomplished, all playable from your browser, making what would become dubbed legendarily RuneScape a one-of-a-kind MMORPG experience. RuneScape might look quite different, at least from what you're watching on screen, when you take a look at the first two iterations especially, since the game is not only still around in 2026, old school RuneScape is a reimagining of classic RuneScape put into more of a modern body, and it's one of the more successful MMORPGs, period, I should add. But the core remains the same. You spawn into a world, choose your skills and identity simply based on what you chose to apply yourself to. Want to be a Fletcher and an archer? That's a thing. Perhaps a cook who whacks his own chickens and cows personally? What if you wanted to be a powerful mage who uses their magic for good? Your skills led to more skills or crafting, and these all led to direct power or wealth gain in some sort of way, making the game quite connected and heavily economical focused, like pretty much all worlds should be really. While early RuneScape was quite limited, it did have some early and iconic quests, like Cook's Assistant, Demonslayer, and Restless Ghost, which helped develop the world and set the tone of what RuneScape was supposed to be about, adventuring. Sure, the game had an obvious focus on grinding with 28 different skills to level in modern times, and a long road of progression for each of them that usually includes a power increase along the way, but RuneScape was about adventuring, and being and playing exactly how you wanted to play. It was a fairly sandbox game, but it managed to keep adding quests over the years to expand the lore, world, and story further too. Quests that required some thinking, and were outside of the box. They actually took effort to complete, and nearly all of them would be worth the effort and then some, having probably some of the best quests in MMORPG history. But most importantly, besides being ever-changing, RuneScape was also ever-growing, with each subsequent version of the game offering better graphics, UI, and gameplay. Well, usually. Sort of. They've been carried largely by the community there for a minute, but this is why it still manages to be a relevant IP with both RuneScape 3 or old school RuneScape, an ode to the classic, with some serious upgrades and a community focus on new voted on content. The team at Jagex, the company behind RuneScape, was a proper family, literally, being founded largely by the Gower family, or Gower brothers as they are often affectionately called. These English brothers from Nottingham would go on to become some of the most well-known developers in their country. Andrew, Paul, and Ian were heavily involved in RuneScape, from founding the company behind it, Jagex, to lead designing the game and even writing the majority of the game's iconic and classic quests. But this powerful brotherhood would shift heavily in 2005, though it probably started a little bit before that. Even though Andrew was like the leader behind everything, he did not want to be the CEO. They hired Constant Tedder and had another person be CEO because Andrew and the Gower brothers weren't really that interested in the business parts. This powerful brotherhood would shift heavily in 2005, when investment dollars would enter the picture. Now, we don't know the specifics of the deal or why they even wanted one in the first place, but we know in October of 2005, Jagex would receive serious investment from Insight Venture Partners. While this wouldn't lead to any serious red flag changes or rumblings early on, the Gower brothers would later admit that they thought that taking investment would never lead to potentially being able to lose creative control, which was their main focus naturally, as the lifeblood of RuneScape in many ways. There are also some claims that Andrew Gower gave up his shares, being told that they would also respect his creative vision without a contract confirming this, which allowed them to disable him as a powerful figure and then take control. At least this is what happened during the major ripple effect that would happen after the 2005 investment, as in 2010, they would receive even more investment funding from two other sources, this time the Rain Group and Spectrum Equity. Insight, though, wouldn't back down and would heavily increase their shares in the process, giving them a 55% stake of the company. My guess is that the other two groups combined for at least 15%, leaving only 30% of the stake of the company remaining, which backs up reports that people claimed that Andrew Gower was a third of the company, though we're not sure if that was just referring to his seat on the board. Insight likely did this as to not lose the majority of their investment against other rising investors, and to attain ownership of the game and company potentially. Andrew would not only leave Jagex's board of directors, he would be removed from all mentions and credits regarding RuneScape 2. The former CEO of Jagex, who was still a member of the board of directors as well, Constant Tedder, would also exit just 1 year later. But anyway, so sure, the Gower brothers were a bit green in business, but can you blame them? They were artists who made a really good game, and then suddenly had thrusted themselves into a massive business world they didn't have a choice but to tackle. They tried to negotiate their art properly, and just failed when presented with people who were just more capable at that sort of thing. I mean, they were game developers and world creators after all. As for taking investment in the first place, it's hard to know if it was necessary. They could have been growing so fast they needed investment, or thought the investment would skyrocket their growth to make it all worth it in the end. Instead, Andrew Gower, the face of RuneScape, would depart and quietly form his own company near the end of 2010, dubbed Fen Research, a video game studio keen on staying in the game, so to say. Set out with different intentions this time though, as Andrew talked about how a large motivating factor originally behind RuneScape was wanting to be able to create and afford games that he couldn't when growing up in humble beginnings. Andrew had money now, but lost his life's work essentially. Many wouldn't hold it against him if he decided to just kind of, fuck off and not try again, right off into the sunset with a bunch of money. But that wasn't an option for Andrew. Brighter Shores was seemingly about proving doubters wrong, perhaps proving to Andrew that he could do it again. The timeline concerning Fen Research is a bit confusing. Andrew has said himself the engine development for their next game at Fen Research hadn't really begun until 2017, but according to a timeline he also released, in other reports, the engine development started shortly after the founding of the company and was actually set on a different game altogether, Chasm, a game that was later abandoned and then repurposed into what would become known as Brighter Shores. Development for Brighter Shores would begin in the fall of 2016. Andrew would every now and then on his Twitter update the hopeful followers, hoping that he could repeat the magic he accomplished with RuneScape. Not his words, but everybody else was thinking that. But as I already stated, Andrew claimed the engine for Brighter Shores began work sometime in the summer of 2017. This would continue for another solid 4 years before Andrew would announce it on Twitter they were finally done with the new graphics engine they were working on, and that he could shift his full attention to the actual game development on Brighter Shores. This was pretty crucial considering he is credited as the lead designer on the game, which just seems kind of absurd to me, when he also was in charge of the professions in the game, giving him the job of engine lead, development lead, and systems lead. Sure, this was more common in smaller, more tight-knit, elite companies like Valve, for example, and when you're bootstrapping, trying not to just spend way too much money too quickly, but Andrew was also the face of his company. It just seemed like he was stretching himself a bit too thin, which would have some serious ramifications Now, there is a serious debate in the Brighter Shores community and many other MMORPGs and MMORPG communities concerning developing your own proprietary engine versus just using an already established one such as like Unreal or Unity. And while I can't exactly answer this debate in a quick video section or without enough proper sample sizing, I will do my best to explain both sides and arguments equally. Using your own engine is powerful for a number of reasons. First, you can design it for exactly the purpose you need it for, versus having to reverse engineer it, such as with the Unreal Engine. Second, it is most likely leaner than a modern engine and can save some space and time. Third, even if the engine doesn't lead to a successful game, you can salvage the engine for another potential game, or sell the license to make a profit or keep your video game studio cooking and afloat. Especially in the case of MMORPGs or online RPGs, since their engines are so specific to the genre and extremely complex to navigate, so there are some serious strengths to designing your own engine. But what about the downsides? Well, the first and simplest downside is the time invested into the engine. It's going to be hefty. Amazon Game Studios, when I visited them, told me that more than 60% of their development time was spent on just the engine they worked on, Lumberyard, which was a repurposed CryEngine spinoff. And here, in the case of Finn Research, they would spend 4 to 6 years working on their engine, which was longer than some games' development cycles. Second, it makes it difficult to hire new talent, because every time you do, you have to teach them your new engine, versus them coming in with skills that were already applicable and ready to go. Third is, you know the engine can work, so you have less ability to invest into something that could potentially not net you anything in the end. The issue I have with how Andrew went about the engine development here is that he could have had some of his development team, in charge of developing the world, lore, story, and developing why things matter, while he was finishing off the engine. It would have been far more productive, right? Because that's the thing with building your own engine, people have to see the payoff or it wasn't going to be noticeable enough to affect them in the first place anyway. It perhaps could have been just accomplished with using an already existing engine. Although Andrew recently had only shifted to development focus on Brighter Shores, the game would be announced March 13th, 2021 anyway. Andrew Gower had such a name that he couldn't hide from the press, and you see this in how the new game was being hyped, being called a RuneScape creator post-creation specifically. Paul and Ian Gower would also join the team, bolstering it heavily, with Paul being in charge of the story and world of the game, and Ian focusing on SFX and music just like old times, making this a true RuneScape reunion. Brighter Shores was set to have a similar top-down isometric perspective, and was reminiscent of RuneScape and CRPGs. Though Finn Research would promise that more than a look back was going to be in Brighter Shores, as they would also be promising to look forward on to Brighter Shores. Just kidding, I added that last part. Finn would also promise a way to cut down on the grinding issue in the genre by utilizing innovative game design to combat it, one of the most difficult forms of design. Sure, it wasn't being sold as the next RuneScape yet, or even ever, really, but Brighter Shores had seemingly a bright future ahead of it based on how it was being sold. There was a lot to like there, whether it was set to be a RuneScape successor or not. Andrew would, on Twitter, unprompted, explain he's an honest artist even if it gets him in trouble. I can relate to that. But he would explain the philosophy behind the design with Brighter Shores, which was refreshing, but also a bit worrying even early on. August 2024, and Andrew would claim that Brighter Shores was going into early access because it was lacking PvP, and until it was able to include it, it would remain in early access. The problem is that RuneScape 1 only took 5 months to achieve that feat, something that would seemingly escape Brighter Shores for some reason. If you're going to take longer than the game from 2001, I think you should probably cover your bases a bit better. What I mean is this: if you aren't going to launch a PvP game into early access effectively, or a game that has it, you should make sure that you have really good PvE in everywhere else game. Because if people don't like that offering, they aren't going to return to the game when it has PvP. I've just never seen this be a real thing, from survival games to online RPGs to MMORPGs. I mean, think about Final Fantasy XIV. It's the opposite of that trope. It has good PvE and story, which ended up motivating people to actually try the PvP. Worse than not having PvP in my eyes was the lack of player-to-player trading, or P2P trading, something that was promised for launch, but would take months to even hit the game after. How can you launch a multiplayer game, let alone one with an online world, without player trading? It's just bizarre to me. And what benefit do you have to even doing that, especially if you are self-funded like Andrew Gower claimed? I have heard Andrew Gower explain that EA was about acquiring feedback, but you already know people are going to hate not having a core basic feature from 20 years older, and stack this into the same bin with not having PvP, and these are less of some minor features missing and more like big chunks of the game missing. You don't have to focus group that. You know people are gonna hate that. I mean, imagine RuneScape without trading or PvP. I can't. That's the problem. No matter how you try to free yourself from your previous game's shadow, people aren't going to let you. You're famous. You're really successful. So you either have to beat those expectations, which of course is not easy, or circumvent them by making something else altogether. Something some would later accuse Brighter Shores of being more like, at least the latter that is. Missing core features or not, Finn Research, or Andrew Gower, depending on how their decision-making process worked, would push into early access regardless November 6th, 2024, trusting the pre-launch phase to kind of work out all the kinks and afford them enough time to fix any upcoming issues and further develop the game's core. But this would prove to be a catastrophic mistake for the game, as many of the negative reviews levied at the game were related to how the base game systems worked, and the lack of core expected features too. Brighter Shores gameplay can be summed up quite simply. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, with one edge being a bit sharper than the other, perhaps. Essentially, Brighter Shores is a collection of professions or mini-games that aren't inherently connected to each other or the world itself, including the combat. For example, you sell what you make in Brighter Shores to vendors for gold, making the game more about sinking more gold into a craft to then sell for more gold than feeling connected to the world or its inhabitants. For contrast, I remember playing RuneScape with friends in middle school, and we all had crafts and things to focus on since we were a small group of free-to-play players. Because of our teamwork, this would eventually allow us to make enough to upgrade our gear and skills as a group. Someone was making the weapons, another the food, and of course someone was on smithy duty, me, and all of it was needed to succeed and further progress your character. Crafting and gathering in Brighter Shores felt more like chores and busy work than a proper crafting system that was designed to be fun, since that's what games are about. Let's talk about the combat in Brighter Shores. Or not, since I don't really want to talk about it since I despise it. To be fair, I've been a longtime hater of RuneScape's combat too, but I understood why they had that combat system, given how the game had grown so humbly and was developed. But Brighter Shores managed to somehow have a worse combat system than all the RuneScape games and clones that I have played. That's at least a dozen, and just about any other isometric multiplayer game. The combat consists of asking an NPC to engage in combat with you, 1 versus 1. It feels like, let's have a duel! Or being the appropriate level against an aggressive mob. You then take turns beating on each other, which might sound familiar, and no. Don't think about that. But the difference here is that the only other action you can do besides fighting in auto combat is run or drink a potion. The combat is incredibly simplistic, feeling more like an idle game than an old school RPG. Whereas fights against mobs below or above your level sometimes feel exactly the same, and fighting a new mob really is just fighting a new skin of a mob, providing nothing new or interesting to overcome or observe. Sure, you can backpedal and shoot, and that looks pretty cool, and move your character in some unique ways, but RuneScape also allowed for this sort of stuff, and even allowed for you to tag multiple mobs and fight multiple mobs at the same time, and managed to have faster and cleaner looking animations during the process somehow. All the innovations some player made that RuneScape brought over time were missing in Brighter Shores. The ability to do weapon switches because of abilities. The need to plan for having consumables and stuff like that. Here, there's no planning needed. As soon as you finish your 1v1 fight against another mob, you're healed to full, and you get to restart the process all over again. And here's the part that people probably hate the most about the game. The content in the game is designed into episodes, which actually act as contained zones filled with content and things to do. But in a completely shocking development, episodes were actually specific to your character's skills, meaning that if you finished an episode and moved to the next, your skills essentially would reset in that region, and then the process would reset again. Yes, even your combat ability would reset, as you would be expected to level up a new combat profession and gathering profession in the process. That's because certain gathering or crafting professions are also restricted to certain episodes, so they wouldn't necessarily restart, but you had to restart as a gathering profession or crafting profession because you had to start on a new one. Like for example, in episode 2, you had botanist, woodcutter, and carpenter that weren't introduced until episode 2. This heavily segments the progression in the game and effectively makes it to where players must do things that they don't want to do for them to properly adventure the way that they would want, which sort of defeats the purpose of playing an MMORPG. Oh, speaking of which, that's not what Brighter Shores was, despite being sold that way. While advertised as a massively multiplayer online RPG, Brighter Shores was closer to an online RPG, something like Phantasy Star Online, Elite Dangerous, or even Conan Exiles. Not only did it divide the map and world into a massive amount of areas, small in size, making the world feel more like a maze or a mix of puzzle pieces more than a connected world. Each of these areas also have incredibly small player caps, being smaller than the Guild Wars 1 channel system, one of the founding fathers of the online RPG genre in the West. And I mean, some of these zones are like literally a bridge. I just can't understand the reasoning here. What's the point of segmenting the world so much? If you wanted players to live more locally in zones like Guild Wars or even Habbo Hotel's room system, they had to actually give players more to do in each of the zones or areas, including reasons and ways to socialize and things to enjoy besides just grinding. Something the game was almost completely lacking, by the way, especially with the social settings, because there was a default setting that you could change that would make your name invisible to other players as well as remove you from the game's chat system. While I like the idea of this for some players, like underage unsupervised players for example, but this was a default setting applied to all players, and it's made worse by the fact that the game doesn't encourage you to group, play, or interact with other players almost at all. There's also no world chat either. And there's never a bridging the gap moment with any of the quest or progression throughout the episodes, where suddenly now they introduce you to like the player world. It feels like two worlds are coexisting at the same time, and not in the Dreamfall Longest Journey kind of way, which was really cool. But in the, if I'm able to ignore all the players around me, why are they even here anyway? And remember, at launch there wasn't PvP, and no ability to trade with other players, meaning unless there was group content, which there wasn't yet, you would effectively be able to completely ignore the other players around you. Now I know some gamers swear by this normally in modern MMORPGs and virtual worlds, but if nearly everyone is able to ignore other players and doesn't have to interact with them, why even play an online game at that point? What could be accomplished with being designed for online better than not being designed for it? RuneScape, on the other hand, is a fairly solo-friendly game, which is a largely unique aspect about it, I might add, but it still allows for players to interact, socialize, and even play together. Brighter Shores had nearly nothing to offer for cooperative or even adversarial player gameplay, making it feel like a stale, artificial, idler game more than a MMORPG, especially when most of the gameplay was just clicking on something and having your character do the action only for you to click confirm after. And artificial because the world, despite having actual quests and story, felt so hollow in Brighter Shores. Nothing's memorable about the story or the world. No characters that I keep remembering, no interactions that made me laugh or made me never forget them, and it has this poorly hidden and designed tutorial quest system, which has a large amount of requirements on skills to progress through the episodic content, which doesn't make sense when you consider the same applies to RuneScape, a game with individual and usually not connected quests. Through episodes being split to different areas and the story and questing in Brighter Shores feeling so safe and constrained in this weird segmented way. The writing and humor wasn't even bad either. There just wasn't enough of it to make a mark. Brighter Shores felt like someone was given the painting of what RuneScape was based on a dream they had one night, or after 20 years after forgetting about it, cough, and asked to reimagine it on paper after the fever had dissipated. Broad strokes in places that looked like RuneScape, a whole lot of missed details in the process, and just poor structuring overall. Except that wasn't what happened, because the person largely behind this game was the creator of RuneScape, the one person you would think that would not have that issue. Because even if you never wanted Brighter Shores to be anything like RuneScape, not only did you pick way too many similarities in design that would inevitably have you compared, you simply didn't make a different and unique enough game to stand on its own. Andrew Gower would respond to the criticism, though more so would explain his perspective on the design of Brighter Shores, which was fine, but it made players feel like he was sort of ignoring their pleas. One aspect of Brighter Shores design which has resulted in a lot of discussion has been our decision to have separate combat professions per episode, so I thought I would explain our reasoning for this, and our planned changes in response to player feedback. Now I'm gonna paraphrase with the quotes on screen. Gower would then reassure players that professions weren't being wiped or reset, or being made irrelevant, because when you go to a new episode, you're being introduced to new professions, and thus the existing professions are still untouched, and still useful anytime you're back in episode 1. But the problem here is that the systems weren't connected, and they weren't connected enough, so you didn't have to go back to Hopeport enough, and nothing was making you have to progress into Hope Forest using whatever you learned from Hopeport either. According to Andrew, the reason for the system was that Mr. Gower wanted to maximize how many people were playing the game, even throughout further life cycles with the game, as episodes are introduced. Andrew felt like as monsters would increase in level, the new episodes would alienate the other players. Andrew would then claim that as you see with most MMORPGs as they expand in content, there is a ton of dead content, and other games level scale combat to combat this. But Andrew wanted to satisfy both players who played for hours a day and minutes a day, which seemed almost completely impossible to me. Instead, the system for me basically alienates everyone. Since it's not only a system that no one had asked for, it's attempting to solve problems in a way that nobody wanted. If you have issues with dead content, you have to make your world more livable and sociable, and slowly evolve that world over time, including the older zones. The only thing to do just can't be fighting or progressing through the story. Removing the most common kind of player, typically these days in an MMORPG or virtual world space, a grind power-centric player, seemed completely unwarranted and not very wise. Because if you're trying to attract players who only play your game for minutes a day, you're totally doing it wrong. Why would you pour that much design energy into a player who has such a little impact on your game overall? What MMORPG makes money off of players who barely invest time into the game? And why would a better solution be to just cut the entire thing up into pieces? What I mean is that players who power grind their characters don't just do it because they want to benefit from it mechanically. They also do it because it makes them feel more connected to their character. It makes their character feel more powerful, which makes them feel more powerful and have more fun, because they're playing a power fantasy, which is at the core of what an MMORPG or even an MMORPG is. You can play it like a fantasy, in a way pursuing wealth and fame and power that you just can't in real life. Professions are designed in this way where as you progress through episodes, you have to essentially level up other forms of gathering and professions. You can't be Mr. Fisher your entire game cycle. You have to start doing other activities to technically progress, which is less like being accessible to more players and more like being accessible to letting players do everything, which completely devalues things in the end and ultimately is less accessible. It's like only being able to fish in Lumbridge or only being able to mine in Shiloh Village. And with the episodes, why are they even called episodes when they function like zones or new worlds? Connecting them together is just incredibly intuitive in Brighter Shores, much like the game's map tiles spread throughout. If you really wanted to do an episodic content structure, why not just slow progression down and give yourself time to introduce new content? You could even introduce the episodic story back in previous zones or introduce quests to bring players back to those zones to combat the aforementioned issues of dead content. This is something that Asheron's Call did, which came out around the same time you guys did originally with Runescape. But with modern technology, you can add things like instances and minigames and more. Instead, Brighter Shores is designed like a real-life job where you can't really pour your all into something and see a reward for it, and you're victim to the same speed and requirements as everyone else around you, ruining your individuality. Where's the fantasy? Where's the fun? Where's the wonder of feeling like you're a part of a new world? A world you can conquer? I don't want to be reminded of the real world that much when playing a virtual world. And Brighter Shores, despite the fact that you can basically play the game AFK for most of it, is the kind of game that makes me feel like the real world, in all the worst ways. Andrew would quickly respond with some early updates the same month they dropped, quickly making a decision to axe multiboxing, which was a controversial topic and thing because of how it highly incentivized other players to also play by the same rules and buy more accounts to be competitive. A good overall decision in my books, and the community would respond in kind. But more examples of Finn research being out of touch with the industry would occur with their winter or Christmas update event December 10th, 2024. And this might just seem like I'm taking shots, but that's just because I feel like it was incredibly low effort, and it makes me question how much research anyone on the development team had been doing, including playing any of the modern MMORPGs, or hell, even the classic ones. Ragnarok Online, Guild Wars 1, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars Galaxies, these games all have very involved Christmas events and fun to them. This was a moment you could have shined and showed people what your cozy co-RPG or MMORPG could do, and also just show people once again what made you and your game previously so special. The magic of indirect storytelling, without having to call you the specific hero of the story. But a worse example is the monetization plan used in Brighter Shores, something that I honestly forgot to mention earlier. You have the game's premium services, much like RuneScape or other MMORPGs, and enticing players to pay the subscription for the allure of new content and more episodes. The catch is, in Brighter Shores, the value is all out of whack for some bizarre reason, and is still out of whack. Get this, you pay $7 for a monthly membership or $24 for 3 months, which means you actually pay like $1 extra for some reason. And then you have the $75.99 for a year membership, which only saves you like $8 overall, which is like 1/3 the value that most MMORPGs or online RPGs would give you for the same thing. You're not just getting a subpar product in Brighter Shores, you're getting it at a worse value too. Andrew Gower and team would announce a major combat profession merger in January 2025. This would target the major criticism the game was facing about the resetting combat levels in new episodes by instead making newer episodes progressively more higher in level. You know, like a traditional RPG. The catch was that you had to be locked into the max level of whatever episode you were in, which honestly wasn't a totally bad idea alongside their addition of monsters who scaled to your level, which I'm just not a fan of. But for me, this means again, you have to make the episodes way more than just partial adventures and design them more as full adventures set in a theme park. That idea would work. Instead, we have this incredibly segmented adventure in which I can't really choose how I want to progress through it, and it's also mechanical and safe feeling. It was an improvement, but an improvement on a system that wasn't very good to begin with. I also fail to see how episodic content in Brighter Shores would make me feel more connected to the previous zones I've already completed, when there's effectively no reason for me to be there anymore. The major combat rework would drop March 6th, 2025, and this update would show the complexities of updating a live service game that is already unfinished especially. The community had largely asked and pushed to this sort of more refined design, where now even weapons and armor would prove useful episode to episode. Which I don't even know why I have to say that as like a eureka moment of like why that has to be mentioned, is maybe that should be the norm. But anyway, the problem being is that most of the players that were probably advocating for that already quit the game. Only 989 players at peak were playing the game just 4 months after the game's release. Many players saw you put your flag in the sand and claim you wanted things to work the way that you wanted them to work. Which is fair enough when it works, right? But when it's over something that hasn't been identified as a need or want in the market, you can't then try to claw back at the same player base a few months after already telling them that, well, tough luck. And then there's no public admission in the process either. There's no accountability, and players have moved on from the initial ideas and just aren't going to be keen to check on the new ones now. Ironically, the player base that was remaining wasn't totally thrilled with the update either, as it would divide up their combat skills in different orders, making some players near max level now, or lower in overall level even. In some cases, even making bosses as much as 60 levels higher than they were before. It was just a messy update that now confused the already confused player base even more. And in the end, the update did very little to slow the inevitable burn of the player base Brighter Shores seemed to be going through with every passing month. Though drama would hit the BS community when rumors and reports of a community manager crashing out on feedback would occur in the game's Discord, and even resulting in the banning of a couple of members. Andrew Gower would join the fray as well, when he would make claims that Brighter Shores would be in a sort of better spot if he didn't have to spend so much time listening to the player feedback. A bizarre thing to say out loud, which is probably why the tweet was deleted. In that same tweet, Andrew would admit had the community not pushed for faster content, he wouldn't have even hired more employees, which just makes the project feel more like a hobby side project than a serious online RPG. And I'll just offer some advice. If I was going to be the lead game developer on a major project, you guys probably wouldn't see me post on Twitter anymore, because that's just a place that I shitpost. And once you're the leader and face of a company in game, can't really do that stuff anymore. A series of new quests would be introduced in the spring of 2025, which were relatively well received. The problem being the game reportedly, and that even means including myself as I've played it on 2 separate major occasions with one being at launched with only one single quest. One single quest. So now the game has 3. And these 2 new quests can be done in like a combined 30 minutes or less. There was just so little meat on the bones here, and this is where we have to throw Paul into the fray as well. Paul Gower was supposedly in charge of all of this sort of stuff, and there was very little to show for it. What made your game so special the first time around, that still would be innovative design in a sense, in modern times, the magic of the storytelling and questing in RuneScape was just missing. And player-to-player trading, sorely missing from the launch, would finally make its appearance nearly half a year after launching into early access. The player base would barely move following this though, and not even in a positive direction, as it would drop to 392 players peak by July 2025. Instead of abandoning ship, I had to credit Andrew Gower with seemingly investing even more in doubling the development team in the summer. But think about this, these new developers have to learn a brand new engine to even be useful. And then you aren't even sure that they can make the right contributions either. It could be months until the player base could even feel the impact of this doubling. The Botanist Profession update would drop September 3rd, 2025, and it was honestly the best update the game had received yet. That's because it took a problem in the game, the boring and forgettable gathering system, and now replaced it with a more active and more complex system dubbed Botany. The Botanist not only harvested plants around the map, it could also nurture plants to make them grow faster, including utilizing fertilizer and watering. Further than this, the Botanist would connect to all other professions now through important resources or tools that each of them would provide, such as like needing bamboo to make bamboo stakes. Though Brighter Shores still suffered from the problem of your play not being economically efficient most of the time, which was going to be a total no-sell for economical focused MMORPG players, which might sound strange for me to say this, but like RuneScape fits that bill, guys. Now you can't just be a world-famous fisher and make bank off of food. Speaking of which, Brighter Shores only has cooking for vendoring reasons. For some reason. You have to be a jack of all trades, which means inevitably you're gonna spend time making less money than you could be making with your actual expertise, which is how crafting works even in real life. When you make your crafting system even worse than real life, that's saying something. That's impressive, for all the wrong reasons. The biggest update yet, an update that took the team nearly 5 months to produce, Project Milestone Phase 2 would drop February 9th, 2026. This update is incredibly confusing though, regarding the leveling milestone changes, so bear with me. Whereas levels would originally go from just 1 to 500, now you had them divided into like leveling milestones, looking more like level 112, or like 224. Which just doesn't hit as good or sound as sexy. It actually reminds me of how like the tier system used to work in an early beta version of Albion Online, a system that was quite hated, I should add. But really the most common complaint about the new update was simply, that's it? Nearly half a year and you came up with some number reworkings and some shifting? When I came back and played the game recently, I was just shocked at how little had been added to it. Nothing about the early game experience felt better or varied. And worse, the game was nearly completely abandoned when I was playing it, where I only managed to spot like 3 players during the time. Subsequent updates have done little to dissuade this faltering player base from hemorrhaging further, and as of the summer of 2026, the population is barely alive at just 173 players peak. In the process of trying not to make RuneScape, you ended up with something awfully similar that was basically in every way inferior. Worse, you built a world that players didn't feel connected to, which is how RuneScape was initially able to resonate so strongly. The innovative design that was supposed to bridge the gap and save the day here just wasn't there, and the sum of the rest of the parts was so low, innovation or not, just isn't enough in totality. Andrew Gower seemed more intent on making his game than making a game that the market was asking for. And while I feel for the guy, being plagued by his past that he couldn't quite control and losing control of his creative creation, you either look at it like Andrew had to beat prior expectations grown by the strength of the popularity of RuneScape, or you can look at it like all he had to do was just make the same game, or slightly better at the core, on a new engine. So many players would have given that game a chance, even if it was smaller in scale like Brighter Shores was. You could have even made a smaller, leaner version of RuneScape and just slowly expanded it like you did originally. But let's be honest, I'm not buying that Brighter Shores was ever truly trying to escape the shadow of RuneScape. Controversial design or not, too much of the game is similar, which means inevitably you were going to be compared to that game, your game. And when you can't beat a game that's way older and operates on an ancient engine that you made, limited by the same thing, loyal fans aren't going to be kind to you, even if you are Andrew Gower, the creator of RuneScape. My advice is, if it's worth anything here, and would be listened to by someone like Andrew, is to go back to the drawing board before you pump a bunch more money into something that just doesn't work, and you keep trying to band-aid it when it isn't working. Find that spark again. Start playing games, all kinds of games, and come back with something serious, and I bet people will welcome you with open arms. Especially when this industry, the MMORPG industry, or even the virtual world industry, if you're going to make a smaller online world like an ORPG instead, will welcome you with open arms especially. But sadly, it's much more like Brighter Shores is run into the ground further, as that's the only direction it's headed at this point, and Andrew quietly exits the picture, still the multimillionaire and legendary creator he's been for decades. The timeline has come to an end though, detectives, and we've reached the end of this mystery, if you can call it that, because Brighter Shores might have been anything but a mystery, with many calling its demise as soon as it made its public appearance. But we still had to do some proper investigating and sourcing to make our proper reduction regardless, like a true detective would, you know? Otherwise, we're just like pretty much every other creator or person in the comment section, just saying how they feel. Which is cool, I have feels too, but I try not to base my critique too strongly on them. And so, why did Brighter Shores end up looking more like Darker Shores? Sorry. outdated design, even older than RuneScape itself, lacking innovation and intrigue, an out-of-touch creator, incorrectly sold as an MMORPG, incredibly incomplete and artificial. While Brighter Shores hasn't fallen in battle quite yet, as it continues to hobble on, but I'm quite confident it will not be making a comeback, because it doesn't contain nearly any of the same magic that made RuneScape RuneScape, or Gower's creations what they were the first time around. A magic that is sadly sorely lacking in this day and age, in gaming and in other forms of media too. But no genre more than the MMORPG genre, a genre that sadly needs so much more feelings of adventure these days, and whimsicality, and magic. And that's why I took a chance on Brighter Shores personally. I wanted more opportunities to feel like I was on an adventure again, using more skills than just my ability to swing a sword in a video game. And even with the failure of Brighter Shores, that's what the Gower brothers gave us ultimately, and it was their biggest gift to the industry. But sadly, it was a gift that is still tragically absent from most of the recent game efforts, even including their own. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments below your thoughts on Brighter Shores, and any reasons you think I missed for why it failed ultimately. Until the next case, one of the highest profile ORPG or MMORPG AAA failures we have seen in some time.